Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be learning how to make this Queen Anne's neckline dress with a slanted waistline. Now this dress was inspired by Zainab Safar NG, as you all can see on the thumbnail. So if you're interested in this, let's get started. Now before we begin, I want you all to know that this paper is on a fold and I've gone ahead to draft my start line for both the front and the back. Now this start line is equal on both the front and the back, so that when I'm drafting, whatever I draft on the front will be equally drafted at the back. After that, from the start line, I went ahead to mark out the various points in the body, which are the chest points, the bust points, the under bust points, the waist points, the hip points, and half inch for allowance. Now for this dress, we are going to stop at the hip point and not at the waist because that slanted design extended to the hip. So after marking out all these points, I marked it a second time just to get a very straight line, and then I connected it with a ruler. After ruling, I went ahead to label all the lines. And after labeling the lines, I came in on the start line by my neckline, neck point, which is 3 inches, and half of my shoulder measurement plus half inch allowance, which is 9 inches. I also marked that same 9 inches on the chest line and connected both points together. Now on the midpoint of the line, I came in by half of an inch, and on my chest line, I came in by quarter of my bust measurement plus half inch allowance, and then I connected all the points together to form an armhole. Now from that shoulder point, I came down by half of an inch and connected it to the neck point to form a shoulder slope. And from that slope, I came up by half of an inch to form my shoulder allowance. Now it's time for our darts. On the bust point, under bust, waist and hip point, I came in by half of my nipple to nipple measurements, and then I connected all these points together to form a straight line. Now for my dart measurement, I usually divide half of my nipple to nipple measurements by 2, and then I share that on my both lines for the darts. Now half of my nipple to nipple measurement is 4, divided by 2 is 2 inches. So I came in by 1 inch on both sides. If you join them together, that is 2 inches. Now on the bust points, I came down by half of an inch, and then I connected it to the two dart lines on the under bust points. On this side, I use a slightly curved rule, and on the other part, I use the fuller part of my curved rule. Now, for the chest line, I don't want the dress to start exactly on the chest line. I want it to be fully covered. So I came up by half of 1 inch, and that is going to be my new chest line. Now on the shoulder line, I divided my shoulder line by 2, marked it, and then I connected it to the dart on the bust line. Now after connecting the line, I came up by half of an inch on the bust points, and then after that on the chest line, I came in by 1 inch on both points, and then I connected it to the half inch to form the chest dart. Now I come up by half of an inch just to eliminate any bulginess in the bust line, in the bust points. So after that, on our neckline, the 3 inches we came out by, we're just going to connect it to the dart that is closest to the armhole. And that is our Queen Anne neckline. Now, if you want a curved neckline, you can use a cord rule just to connect it together, and that will be fine. So after connecting it, I went ahead to measure the both darts on the chest line to see if they are equal, and I realized that one dart was longer by half of an inch, so I just replaced that half of an inch to make sure that both of them are equal. Now that we're done with that, it's time for us to mark out our measurements. Now on the chest line, I went ahead to measure out the dart that I took, which is 2 inches, and then after that, I came in by quarter of my bust measurement, which is 9.5 inches. I marked that down, and then I added the 2 inches for the dart, and 1.5 inch for sewing allowance. Now whatever I marked on my chest line, I also marked on my bust line. On the waistline, I came in by quarter of my waist measurement plus the 2 inches that and 1.5 inch sewing allowance, and I marked that down. On the hip line as well, I also came in by quarter of my hip measurement plus the 2 inches that and 1.5 inch sewing allowance. The same thing on the hip line, I connected on the allowance line. And after that, I just connected all the points together with a straight ruler. Now that I'm done with marking out all the measurements, it's time for us to cut out our pattern paper. Now, while cutting, be cautious. So remember that this pattern is on a fold. So make sure that the front and the back is aligned so that the measurement will not be different for the front and the back. Now that I'm done with cutting, I went ahead to open up the pattern paper, and then I arranged them together so that all the dart lines will be joining each other. So after arranging it like so, it's time for us to draft our slope, our slanted waistline. So I want the slope to start from the waistline and to end directly at the hip line. If you want yours to stop midway, you could just find the midpoint between the waist and the hip line and connect it there. But I want mine to stop at the hip line. So from the hip line, I came in by my sewing allowance, and then on the waistline as well, I also came in by my 1.5 inch sewing allowance, and that is where I will start from to connect the slanted waistline. Now after marking both points, I went ahead to trace out these lines with a straight rule. Now mind you, I do not want the waistline to be straight, so the straight rule is just to guide me on how to draft my curved rule. So from the midpoint of the straight line that I traced, I just like used my hand to draft a slanted line, and then on the waistline I used a curved rule to connect it to that same midpoint. Now I use a curved rule on the waistline because that waist part have to be very curvy to show the slanted waistline very well. And after I finished drafting the slanted waistline, I went ahead to cut it out. Now before cutting, I extended the slanted line to the allowance line. Now if you want yours to stop at the midpoint of the waist and the hip, you would also add half-inch allowance on that midpoint and then connect your slanted line. So after that, I just cut it out, and this is it for the front. Now that cut pattern that we removed from the front, we'll have to keep that aside because this is going to be useful while drafting the waist. So just for reference, this is what we cut out from the up part. So I'm going to just seal this up with a tape, and then after sealing it up, I'm just going to keep it aside. Now if you look at this picture here, you will see that this dress is like a bustier that is covered with a jacket. So from this point on, we're going to be calling this part here the jacket. Now, to draft the jacket from the starting line, I came down by the various body measurements, the bust point, chest point, under bust point, waist point, hip point, and half-inch for allowance. And after marking all these points, I decided to connect them with a ruler. Now on the start line, I came in by half of my shoulder measurement plus allowance. I also marked my neck point, and then on the shoulder point, I came down by half of an inch allowance, and I connected it to the neck point to form a slope. On the chest line, I came in by half of shoulder measurement plus allowance, quarter of bust measurement plus allowance. Then I connected the half of shoulder measurement to that on the shoulder line. Now on that line I connected, I found the midpoint of it, came out by half of an inch, and then I connected it to the other points to form my armhole. Now after I was done, I went ahead to just label the lines so as not to get confused. And then on the bust point, I came in by half of my nipple to nipple measurement. I did that on the under bust, on the waist, and connected them together. Now we are not going to be drawing a dart on this jacket part, but we need that line just to guide us. On the shoulder line, I marked the midpoint, and after marking it, I connected it to the line on the bust point. Now, after connecting it, I went ahead to draft my Queen Anne neckline, just like how we did for the bustier. And then I went ahead to mark out all the measurements, which is my bust measurement divided by 4 plus 1.5 inch sewing allowance. There is no dart, so we're not going to add any dart allowance. I did that for both the hip points, the hip measurement divided by 4 plus this allowance, and on the waistline as well. And then I connected all the points together. Now here I just came up by the chest line by 1 inch allowance, so that is going to start the same points that the chest point started in the bustier. After coming up by that 1 inch, I went ahead to retrace my Queen Anne's neckline. Now after retracing that, I came up from the shoulder line by half of an inch, which is going to serve as my shoulder allowance line. And when I was done with that, I went ahead to cut out the pattern paper. As usual, we'll be mindful of the fold because the paper is on a fold. So we'll be mindful of the paper to make sure that both the front and the back aligns. So while cutting, I made a mistake and went ahead to cut out the Queen Anne's neckline. For this jacket part, we are not cutting out any parts, so I went ahead to seal it back with a sellotape. Now it's time for us to draft our slanted waistline. So here I came up by 1 inch, which is actually a mistake. Our slanted waistline starts from the waist point just like it did at the bustier. So on that waist point, you would come in by 1.5 inches, and then on the other part of the paper, just find the midpoint between the hip line and the waistline, and then you will connect these 2 points together. Now for the design on the center part of the jacket, if you look at this picture displayed here, you will see that the first curve extended to the under bust line. So on the under bust line, I'm going to come in by 1 inch because it's not directly on the dart. So from that 1 inch, I'll connect it straight to where the Queen Anne neckline started or stopped. So after connecting that curve, I will now go ahead and draw the second curve, which I attached to the waistline. But then after drawing that curve, I did notice that the curve was a bit short. So I just found the midpoint between the first curve and the second slanted waistline. I marked that down and then I connected them together. Now that I was satisfied with my curve, it's time for us to draw the last curve. Now for the down slanted waistline, it's going to stop at the hip. But if you want yours to not stop at the hip, you will just come up by 5 inch or so and connect it there. But here I want my own to stop at the hip point. Now from that hip point, I came up by 2 inches and came in by my sewing allowance 1.5 inch. So that point I'll connect it to the up, and the down point I'll connect it to the down. Now if you look at this picture, you will realize that this is actually a two-piece, that's a top and a skirt. So if you want yours to be a top, just come up from the hip point by 5 inches, and then from the down part to the 5 inches, you will just connect this curved design as you can see on the picture. And after drawing the curved design, you would go ahead and connect the top line to the top of the curve and the down line to where you want your slope to stop. I hope you understand. Now moving on, I came up from the hip line by 2 inches, came in by 1.5 inches, which is my sewing allowance, and then from that point I'll connect it to the curve at the top. So I connected the curve, and then for the curve on the down part, which is actually the slanted waistline part, you come in on the hip line by 1.5-inch sewing allowance, and then you will just connect it from that point to the midpoint of the slanted waistline. So this is it for the jackets. So here I'm just like tracing out the curve to make it more clearer and visible. And when I was done, I went ahead to cut it out. Now I'm done cutting, and this is the jacket. And this part is the cutout part from the jacket. So I'm going to keep this aside in case I need it as well while drafting my skirt. And I'm also going to keep the jacket aside. So after that, I went ahead to arrange both the bustier and the jacket together to see if it's aligned. And as you all can see, it did align. Now for the back, I started by drafting my start line, and then from the start line I went ahead to mark out the various points in the bodice, which are the chest point, the bust point, the waist point, and the allowance. After marking those points, I went ahead to draw it out with a rule. Now initially when I drafted my back, I used my back waistline, which is usually 1.5 inch shorter than the front. But while sewing, it did not align. So I went ahead to retrace the back again with a waistline that is the same as the waistline for the front. So watch out to see how I blended them together. Now after marking out all these points, I came in from the front by 1 inch for my zip allowance, and then from that zip allowance I marked my neck point, which is 3 inches, and I came down by 1 inch and connected them together. After that, I came in by half of my shoulder measurements plus half-inch allowance. On the chest line, I came out by the same measurements, and then I joined them together to form a straight line. On that line, I found the midpoint, and then I marked it. Please do not mind this half-inch I came in by. On the chest line, I came in by quarter of my bust measurement plus half-inch allowance, and then I connected it to the midpoint of the armhole, of the line to form my armhole. On the shoulder line, I came down by half an inch, connected it to the chest line to form a slope. And from that slope, I came up by half of an inch to form my shoulder allowance. Now on the waistline, I came in by 1 inch and connected it to the chest line. I always do this to eliminate any form of bulginess on the waist part of the zip. And after connecting this line, I came out again by 1 inch to retrace my zip allowance line. So I've connected the lines, and this is my new zip allowance line. Now it's time for us to draft our darts. We're not going to start from the zip allowance, but from the main bodice. From the main bodice, I came in by half of my nipple to nipple measurement. I did that on the chest line as well. and then I connected it together, all the points together. After connecting them on the waist point, I came in by half inch on both sides, and then I connected it to the chest line. Now when drafting this dart, you will notice that the dart is slanted, but you don't have to worry about that because our waist at the back is slanted. So when you wear your actual fabric, it will come out straight. So after drafting the dart, I went ahead to mark out all the measurements. So guys, when I was marking out the measurements, I realized that my camera was not recording. But what I did was, after marking out the measurements, I just went ahead to cut out my pattern paper. And then after cutting it out, it's time for us to blend our waist. Now if you notice why I was drafting, this our back pattern is the same 17 inches as the front. So to blend it up on the zip line, on the zip points, I came up by 1 inch, which is where my back is actually meant to start. And then I slided it to the other side of the waistline and cut it out. So with this method, the side of our back would actually blend with the front of this dress, and the center back and the center side of the back will still be the same length as our actual back length. Now I would have avoided this if I actually took out my bust dart from the front part, but I didn't do that, so this is another way to counter it. Now we have come to the end of the drafting part of this dress. Because of time, we are going to be stopping here. I will leave a link for the sewing part on my description tab. If you have a question, please leave it in the comment section. Please like and subscribe to get more of my videos and tutorials, and I'll see you all in the sewing part.